discussing about the various lecture series. Our resource person today is Dr. Ritu Priyadharshi. She basically is presently working as an assistant professor in the Department of Science and Humanities in Shri Krishna College of Engineering and Technology, which is in Coimbatore, Tamil Nadu. Dr. Priyadharshi is a passionate writer and has written poems, play scripts, journals, and articles. She believes that the 4 A's which she has adopted in her life, and the 4 A's that she has adopted are avoid, alter, accept, and adapt, has been a major force in completely changing her life in various forms. The 10 years of her journey in the field of education has nurtured her as a better individual from within and out. Recently, Dr. Priyadharshi received the International Educator Award of 2021 from the International Institute of Organized Research, which is a registered MSME under the Government of India. Serving the society and sharing knowledge is what Dr. Priyadharshi believes her life to be in a nutshell. Dr. Priyadharshi, on behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, thank you for accepting our invitation, and thank you for accepting to be the resource person today and talking on this important part of American history titled the Colonial Period, Puritanism and Literature, which ranges from 1607 to 1765. So on behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, I welcome you, Dr. Priyadharshi, and I welcome all the participants. The platform is all yours, Dr. Priyadharshi.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Saket. Thank you so much. So warm evening to all. As Dr. Saket said, I am Dr. Ritu Priyadharshi, presently working in Shri Krishna College, Coimbatore. So to begin with our 10 days of lecture series, I would like to bridge yesterday's topic with today. So just a small recap of what happened yesterday in our exploration period. So yes, the history of American literature. Today our expedition is towards the colonial period. Yes, and the Native Americans. The Native Americans, the first inhabitants of the continent, did not develop anything we can call as literature. Their stories or poems were spread orally. So which means the history of American literature literally begins with the age of colonialism. So their oral genres are lyrics, chants, myths, fairy tales, humorous anecdotes, incantation, riddles, proverbs, epics, and legendary histories. Now, when we talk about the history of American literature, it was the era of colonizing the continent. Since not only the English explored and claimed the territories, the beginning of American literature are more or less connected also with French, Spanish, or Dutch literatures as well. So the history of American English begins with the arrival of English-speaking Europeans. At first, American literature was naturally a colonial literature, which means the authors who were Englishmen and who taught and wrote as such. John Smith, a soldier of fortune, is credited with the initiation of American literature. To begin with the colonial literature, which is from 1607 to 1765, there are few main points that we are supposed to keep in mind. Basically, the 5 main points. So the first is it started with the founding of Jamestown. In 1607, 104 Englishmen and boys arrived in North America to start a settlement. On May 13, they picked up Jamestown, Virginia for their settlement, which was named after King James I. The settlement became the first permanent English settlement in North America. The second one, the Half-Way Covenant in 1662. So covenant is basically a compromise, an agreement that we make that you do or not to do. So really, this is a religious political solution adopted by the 17th century New England Congregationalists, also called as Puritans, that allowed the children of baptized but unconverted church members to be baptized, and thus became the church members and have all political rights. The third, colonial literature would go without any spice if we are not talking about Puritanism. So, Puritanism and Puritans. Puritan ideas and values greatly influenced the political, social, and economic development of the New England colonies in many ways between 1630 and 1660s. So Puritans came to the Americas like many other people in order to create perfect and ideal Christian society. This mindset became the building block for the colonies. So they did not go there to conquer, but they ventured there mainly to spread Christianity and expand. So it became so rooted into the foundation of New England, it affected the colonies economically, socially, and politically. John Higgins stated that this is a plantation of religion, not a plantation of trade. So people usually used to colonize thinking it is for trade or for some business, commerce. But here he states this is a plantation of religion and not for trade. This statement shows that in the Puritans' eyes, it was frowned upon to care more about the economic prosperity of the colony than the word of God and worship of God. So Higgins also stated that worldly gain was not the design of the people of New England, but the religion was. So Puritanism. So these two statements greatly showed the fact that Puritans relied on their faithfulness to God to prosper as a community. Puritans focused primarily on acquiring their very basic needs for living and even then gave whatever extra they had to the less fortunate Puritans of their colony. Along with affecting colonies economically, the Puritans very much also affected their social norms and due to their mindset. Right. The next important factor here is the Salem witch trials, okay, which happened in 1692. The Salem witch trials occurred in colonial Massachusetts between 1692 and 1693. More than 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft, the devil's magic, and 20 were executed. Eventually, the colony admitted that the trials were a mistake and compensated the families of those convicted. Since then, the story of these trials has become synonymous with paranoia and injustice, and it continues to beguile the popular imagination more than 300 years. First printing press in Charlestown, which happened in 1730. So, Louis Timothy was a prominent colonial American printer in the colonies of Pennsylvania and South Carolina who worked for Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was the first American librarian. But this printing press and the process ended with the Stamp Act when the colonies were forced to see themselves as separate from England. So, a general description about the period. We are talking about a colonial period, so giving you a general description about the period. Writing was generally utilitarian, polemical, or religious. Religious poetry, sermons, etc. It was influenced by Puritanism, Enlightenment, the Great Awakening, and Belletras didn't flourish. So here, our Belletras are our imaginative work. It is a French word actually. So it is a fine works which was imaginative and it did not flourish. So had other things to deal with like wilderness, Indian diseases, and later the wealth, the government, progress, political rights, all these became, a difficult factor. Benjamin Franklin created the first American fictional character, Richard Saunders. So lots of high quality literature, but very little that did not self-consciously take English authors as models, and even less that could merit the term ballistic. So the characteristics of this period. It was the era of colonizing the continent, since not only the English explored and claimed the territories, the beginning of the American literature or more or less connected with French, Spanish, or Dutch and literatures as well. That's what I told earlier. So the first writers brought mainly English ideas and the ways of writing, which merely early American literature is based on the literature of England. As years passed by and literary theory developed, the writers who adopted the English style are now sometimes called as pale faces. So the best example for pale faces writers are Franklin or Longfellow and James Bond. Their poetry is sometimes referred to as cooked poetry. We'll tell cooked stories, right? When we take it up from somewhere. So this is what even they said, the cooked poetry, when they have the ideologies from English. So it was called as a cooked poetry. On the other hand, there were authors who explored new topics and helped shape America's own literary tradition. Those are called as redskins. So Whitman, Emerson, the Beat Generation, their poetry is all referred to as raw poetry. Religion played an important part in the writer's life. Many writings of the period were sermons, theological books. The fact that the Pilgrims landed in the Massachusetts Bay in 1620 had an immense influence on the culture of the newly developing colonial system. The topics. The topics common in the early periods were connected with the issues of living in the new land. So the issues are like agriculture, exploration, relationship with the native people, and obviously the traveling. So the travel logs and the journals, what happened during their journey. The major themes, the writer basically these are the major themes that they would prefer. That is, literature tended to follow religious and philosophical themes. Enlightenment, Puritans, almanacs, and clever, light-hearted, graceful, melodious, influenced by classical Latin, occasionally cynical, epigrammatic, and witty. Very few Bellatrix imaginative work. So the major themes include will of work, relationship between human nature, difference between European and Native American culture, spiritual feeling and entertainment, and political. As I told you earlier, the colonial period would go nil without Puritans and Puritanism. So let us go in detail with Puritans and Puritanism. The Puritans, a social and cultural force led by John Winthrop, established in Massachusetts Bay Colony 1628. Religious reformers were there, stayed within the Church of England to purify from within. So theocracy, radical, conservative, and their nicknames were Calvinists. Puritans and Puritanism. The Puritans, most important in American literature, they were all well educated, primarily of middle class, grounded in religious beliefs, believed in predestination and elections, wanted ideal society. And is there somewhere better than here? That would be their process. Like, let it be faith or let it be the spread of Christianity. Their only thought would be, is there something better than here? So the two, they were split into two: the saved, the people who were saved, and the people who were damned. So the people who were saved would definitely be the prominent, the clergies, the wealthy, and the healthy people. And the damned are obviously the poor, the sick, and the lower class. Puritan beliefs just in three: God, community, and self. Okay. They believed in omnipotent God, believed in unmerciful God. They believed that God is a very strict person. So once when you don't follow his words, when you don't obey the Bible, the religion, then God is going to be unmerciful, which means he's very strict. The punishment is directly going to be, what you're doing is a sin. So you will be punished. So they believed in the Bible, believed in original sin. They believed in predestination, believed in education for men and women. And they also believed that men are superior and women are supposed to listen to men. And believed in daily workings of God, believed in Puritan work of ethic. So the Great Awakening, so 1730s, led by Jonathan Edwards and clergy, bring Puritans back, and it is a series of tent meetings, greater importance of individual and spiritual experiences. So they would gather in a place, they would stand there and they would talk about God. So what are the things that you're supposed to do and what is that you're not supposed to do? His famous work, Angry God, okay, a sermon, sinners and angry God. So what would happen if you are a sinner? What we'll be doing in detail, but I'm just to give you a gist. What would happen? You being a sinner, what would be God's reaction? What is going to happen? He has given it in the work. So that is all their sermons. It wasn't taken into like a book that we have. The sermons that was happening, it was recorded and that was published, probably through pamphlets. Covenant theology. So this is the second religious movement actually. It softened the idea of predestination, gives control, must do two things. One, believe in deity and do good things on earth. You do good deeds on earth, you are taken to heaven. You do all bad things and you are taken to hell. So these were the two things that they believed in. The literature of the Puritans: no novels, no short stories, no drama, little poetry, and mostly all non-fiction. Annie Bradstreet, Edward Taylor, Jonathan Edwards are the famous poets of the period. The function of the Puritan writers. So they write for purpose. So their main function is to instruct people about secular things on religious level, to make God more relevant to the universe and to glorify God. So, subject and their style is nothing but religion and God, the daily happenings, the simple style of writing. The Puritans, apart from spreading Christianity and trying to, convert people, getting them into Christian, into the church, baptism, and all that, they also focused on few legacies, like first free public school. They founded Harvard and Yale. They set up the first printing press in the colonies. They need for moral justification for private, public, and governmental acts. The questioning of for freedom, the Puritan work ethic, fascination with the city upon the hill. So they also had their own legacies. The second main point that we are going to focus while we are talking about the colonial period, soon after the Puritan and Puritans, the slave narratives. Slavery. Obviously, when people colonize us, they used to take people as slave. So the slave narratives comprise one of the most influential traditions in American literature, shaping the form and themes of some of the most celebrated and controversial writing, both in fiction and in autobiography, in the history of United States. So, slave narratives. The vast majority of American slave narratives were authored by African Americans, but African born Muslims who wrote in Arabic, the Cuban poet Juan Francisco Manazzo, and a handful of white American sailors taken captive by the North African pirates also penned narratives of their enslavement during the 19th century. From 1760 to the end of the Civil War in the United States, approximately 100 autobiographies of the fugitive of former slaves appeared. The first slave narrative. We will be focusing on a slave narrative, but at the end, and I'm not talking about this over here because here I'm talking about the first slave narrative. There I'm going to talk about the first slave narrative with an autobiographical touch. So the first slave narrative to become an international bestseller was the two-volume interesting narrative of life of Olda Equiona or Gustav Vasa, the African, written by himself, which traces Equino's character from boyhood in the West Africa through the dreadful transatlantic Middle Passage to eventful freedom and economic success as a British citizen. So, typically, the American slave narrative centers on the narrator's rite of passage from slavery in the South to freedom in the North. So, they will be captivated in the South and they would escape, or they move away from the place, or they pay some amount and get their freedom and they move to the North. So, slavery is documented as a condition of extreme deprivation, necessitating increasing forceful resistance. After a harrowing and suspenseful escape, the slave's attainment of freedom is signaled not simply by reaching the free states of the North, but by taking a new name and dedication to anti slavery activism. So, we have a number of works we have the major works like Edward Taylor's religious poetry, Jonathan Edwards' religious and philosophic treatise, like as I told you, Sinners in the Hands of Angry God, Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac, and Annie Bradstreet, The Tenth Muse, lately sprung up in Africa, Bay Slam book, first printed in America. So the major writers. Let us take few major writers, starting with John Smith, very fondly called as Captain John Smith. So Captain John Smith from 1580 to 1631 is considered to be the first American writer. He was an explorer and colonist. He helped to found Jamestown in 1607. His work, A True Relation of Virginia, is said to be the first American book written in English. It describes the problem of colonizing the area. The second person is William Bartford, 1590 to 1657, was a Puritan writer who described life in early English settlement. His book of Plymouth Plantation is full of religious topics and depiction of a difficult life in the colony. Nathaniel Ward, 1578 to 1652, was a Puritan clergyman and a pamphleteer in England and Massachusetts. He wrote the first constitution in North America in 1641. Ward amusingly defended the status quo and railed at colonists who sponsored newfangled notions, a variety of counter arguments to such a conservative view well published. John Winthrop, 1587, or usually our writers in the 16th century, we don't have the birth record as such. It is either their date of baptism or their birth year. So the year is tentative here. It is 1587 or 88, but he passed away in 1649, was an English Puritan lawyer and one of the leading figures in founding the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the second major settlement in New England following the Plymouth Colony. So the Journal of John Winthrop, written in 1630 to 49, told sympathetically of the attempt of Massachusetts Bay Colony to form a theocracy, a state with God as its head and with its laws based upon the Bible. So later defenders of theocratic idol were Increase Mather and his son Cotton Mather. So Increase Mather, 1639 to 1723, was an American Puritan clergyman in Massachusetts Bay Colony and president of Harvard College for 20 years. So he was influential in administration of the colony during a time that coincided with the notorious slave witch trials, Salem witch trials. Cotton Mather, his son, was a New England Puritan minister, prolific author, and a pamphleteer, one of the most important intellectual figures in English-speaking colonial America. Mather is remembered today chiefly for his Magdalena Christi Americana 1702 and other works of history, for his scientific contributions to plant hybridization and to the promotion of inoculation as means of preventing smallpox and other infectious diseases, and for his involvement, like his father, in the events surrounding the Salem witch trials between 1692 to 93. William Bartford. We don't have the record of his baptism or birth, but we know that he passed away in November 1792. He was an English scholar and an Anglican clergy. William Bartford's History of Plymouth Plantation showed how his pilgrims separatists broke completely with Anglicanism. Roger Williams, 1603 to 1683, was a Puritan minister, theologian, and author who founded Providence Plantations, which became the colony of Rhode Island. He was a staunch advocate for religious freedom, separation of church and state, and fair dealings with Native Americans, and he was one of the first abolitionists. Even more radical than Bradford was Roger Williams, who in a series of controversial pamphlets advocated and not only the separation of the church and state, but also the vesting of power in the people and the tolerance of different religious beliefs. Stepping into poetry. So now we'll look upon poetry, prose, and the slave narratives. Focusing on poetry, we are going to focus on three most prominent writers: Michael Wigglesworth, Annie Bradstreet, and Edward Taylor. So, talking about Michael Wigglesworth. Michael Wigglesworth, like Taylor, an English born, Harvard educated Puritan minister who practiced medicine, is the third New England colonial poet of note. He continues the Puritan themes in his best known work, The Day of Doom. Okay, in 1662, a long narrative that often falls into the doggerel, this terrifying popularization of Calvinist doctrine was the most popular poem of the colonial period. The first American bestseller is an appalling portrait of the damnation to the hell in Balmeter. Michael Wigglesworth, The Day of the Doom. So the poem describes the day of the judgment in which God sentences men either to heaven or to hell. So the poem bases around how weak Puritans are falling into sin and self satisfaction. It narrates the details of the second coming of the Christ and the judgment day. So the day of doom creates a mental picture of what it would be like on the day of the judgment if you don't obey God, if you don't follow the Bible. The poem harshly describes God's justice and the horrors awaiting for the sinners. So you can imagine, when we read this poem, we could actually imagine, it's a long narrative poem, and we could imagine the day, how it is going to be when we don't follow the Bible, and what will happen if we are sinners. Michael Wigglesworth, the poem is the longest poem of the colonial period with 224 stanzas. The second person is Annie Bradstreet. Annie Bradstreet, between 1612 to 1672, was the most prominent of early English poets of North America and the first writer in England's North American colonies to be published. She is the first Puritan figure in American literature and notable for her large corpus of poetry as well as personal writings published posthumously. Her first collection is the 10th Muse, lately sprung up in America, was widely read in America and England. So she is the first poet and the first female writer in British North American colonies to be published. Preferred her long religious poems on conventional subjects such as seasons. Contemporary readers most enjoy the witty poems on the subject from daily life and her warm and loving poems to her husband and children. This is one of her poems which she has written to her husband, to my dear and loving husband. So the poem goes like this. Okay. Annie Bradstreet, a Puritan, very educated for a woman in that time, and she sailed to America in 1630. Poems were published in 1650. The 10th Muse, lately sprung up in America by a gentlewoman of those parts, America's first poet and first female poet to be published both in London and in America. So, talking about her work, The 10th Muse, lately sprung up in America, is a collection of poems by Annie Bradstreet. The volume begins with a number of short poems honoring Bradstreet by various New England worthies, and it was followed by a respective poem dedicated to her father, Thomas Dudley. Then Annie Bradstreet wrote longer scholar poems and on the four elements like fire, earth, and water, air. Four humors or bodily fluids, the four ages of life, the four seasons, the four monarchies. She focused on the four elements basically. So, following these come shorter verses such as a dialogue between a Old and a New England, an elegy for Sir Philip Sidney, a poem in praise of French poet, Du Bartas, and whom the Puritans held in high esteem. Right. The 10th Muse, the entire title runs through pages, but I'm just telling it as the 10th Muse, is certainly not the title that Annie Bradstreet chose for herself. For while she was realistically aware of her talent, and she would have considered it pretentious to call herself the 10th Muse, a later day addition to the 9 immortal sisters, whom the ancient Greeks saw as inspiring artists of every sort. Yet, the 10th Muse and the several poems constitute one of the two most remarkable poetic achievements in English of the colonial period. Our next person is Edward Taylor, a colonial American poet, a pastor, and a physician. He is brilliant. He is a poet and minister, the son of yeoman farmer, a teacher who sailed to New England in 1668 rather than take an oath of loyalty to the Church of England. The best educated man in the area, and he put his knowledge to use working as a town minister, doctor, and a civic leader. Edward Taylor, 1642 to 1729, was an of a English origin and colonial American poet. His work remained unpublished for some 200 years, but since then has established him as one of the foremost writer of his time. His poetry has been characterized as American Baroque as well as metaphysical. His two major works, Preparatory Meditations and God's Determinations, touching his elect. Okay, so the two main works, Preparatory Meditation and God's Determination. So, God's Determination touching his elect is an extended verse sequence thematically setting forth the grace and majesty of God as a drama of sin and redemption. The sacramental meditations, about 200 in number, were described by Taylor as preparatory meditations before my approach to the Last Supper. So, talking about the preparatory meditations, its most important part are meditations of Puritan clergymen put into poetic form as a mental exercise in preparation of administrating the Lord's Supper. In that personal function, they were not meant for publication and, as a consequence, remain unknown for more than 200 years. His meditations are not religious in the sense of a communication between a Christian poet and an audience of the believers. Edward Taylor's preparatory meditations, they are theological in highly professional and intellectual sense. Meditations on dogmatic problems, the theological discourse between biblical scholar and God, to whom he directs urgent appeals. He says, "It grieves me, Lord, my fancy's rusty, rub and brighten on angles substance sharp." So, at the same time, the biblical motto of these meditations received a communicative pastorally function in the extended prose form of sermons preached by Taylor to his congregation before celebrating Last Supper. The second work, God's Determination touching his elect. God's Determinations is largely in dialogue form and the speaker. So, mercy, justice, Christ, Satan, a soul, and a Satan are reminiscent of characters in early English morality plays. This long work, which embodies a contest between Christ and Satan for mankind, is typically Puritan in thought in that it attempts to justify the Calvinist doctrine of the covenant. But Taylor possessed more than the inherent grace of Calvin's theology. He was also gifted with the inherent grace of the true poet. In the prologue to God's Determinations, he humbly seeks aid from great God whom he would praises. He asks, "Lord, can a crumb of earth, the earth outweigh outmatch all mountains, nay, the crystal sky, embosom is in design that shall display and trace into the boundless deity. uh, his major works, the preparatory meditations, I have given you just few words from that, and then God's determinations, where it is packed with redemptions, questions, job, answers, fall, humbling, power, and superficial. Stepping into prose. Here we are going to focus on our Captain John Smith, Roger Williams, Cotton Mather, Jonathan Edward, and Benjamin Franklin. So, to begin with, Captain John Smith, an English soldier, explorer, and author, known for his incredible adventures and expeditions. Embroiled his adventures, the death of his father brought a drastic change in his life, and he started his life as a traveler and an adventurer. So, just to give a small gist about his life, John Smith was an English soldier, as what we see, and he played an important role in the establishment of the colony at Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in America in the 17th century. So, his works, John Smith's first writing about Jamestown, were sent to England on a supply ship along with the early map. So it wasn't a proper work. He just made a note of his travelogue, and he sent it to England on a supply ship. And next comes the General History of Virginia in 1624, where he basically wrote about his lifestyle, what is happening there, how it is all beginning, how they're getting used to the natives, and things like that. Then the true adventures and observations of Captain John Smith. So, as discussed earlier, this Captain John Smith, he started the first American literature work, and it wasn't a proper book, but then piled up things of his travelogue, his experiences, and his adventures. Are Roger Williams. The political and religious leader Roger Williams is best known for his founding the state of Rhode Island and advocating separation of church and state in colonial America. He is also the founder of the first Baptist church in America. So his works, A Key into the Language of America, The Baldy Tenant of Persecution, and his letter to the town of Providence. Cotton Mather was a New England Puritan minister, prolific author, and pamphleteer, one of the most important intellectual figures in the English speaking colonial America. So, Mather is remembered today chiefly for his work and other works of history for his scientific contributions. So, his father, Increase Mather, and Cotton Mather both witnessed the Salem witchcraft, the witch trial. So Martha wrote more than 450 books and pamphlets. So in this Magnalia Christi Americana, which comprises 7 distinct books, many of which depict biographical and historical narratives. Our next person is Jonathan Edwards, a Christian preacher, philosopher, and a theologian. Acknowledged to be America's most important and original philosophical theologian, one of the America's great intellectuals. So Jonathan Edward was an American revivalist, preacher, philosopher, Congregationalist, and a Protestant theologian. His works, like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, he produced a number of important analyses of the movement, distinguishing marks of work, some thoughts concerning the revival, a treatise concerning religious affection, and humble attempt to promote explicit agreement, the life of David Bryant. So, despite his fame, he and his congregation were increasingly alienated until he was dismissed in 1750 over a disagreement concerning the qualifications for the church admissions. So they consider he is going against the church. From there, he assumed the post as a missionary to the Motions and more works at Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where he also wrote the treatise that secured his reputation as one of the most significant philosophical theologians of his time. Freedom on Will, the end for which God created the world and the nature of true virtue, completed between 1753 to 54 and published in 1765, and the original sin. It is very important that we should know what were the 10 considerations that he came for which he was sent out. So, the sinners in the hands of an angry God. So, the first point that he said, God may cast wicked men into hell at any given moment. So, it is not that he'll wait till the death. So, if you are a sinner, you will be immediately sent to hell. That is what he said. The wicked deserve to be cast into hell. Divine justice does not prevent God from destroying the wicked at any moment. The wicked at this moment suffer under God's condemnation to hell. The wicked on earth at this very moment suffer the torments of hell. The wicked must not think simply because they are not physically in health that God, in whose hand the wicked now reside, is not at this very moment as an angry with them. As he is those miserable creatures, he is now tormenting in hell, and who at this very moment do feel and bear the fierceness of his wrath. So we feel that there are things happening, not good things happening around us. We are finding it very difficult. According to him, it is all that we are suffering because we have been tested by the anger, so in the hands of the angry God. At any moment God shall permit him. Satan stands ready to fall upon the wicked and seize them as his own. So at any time, if you are a sinner, God will just wash his hands and you will fall into the hands of Satan. And after which you will be seized by him and you will be act according to the Satan. So if it were not for God's restraints, there are in the souls of wicked men hellish principles reigning, which presently would kindle and flame it out into hellfire. Simply because there are not visible men of death before them at any moment, the wicked should not feel secure. Simply because it is natural to care for oneself or to think that others may care for them, men should not think themselves safe from God's wrath. All that wicked men may do to save themselves from hell's pain shall afford them nothing if they continue to reject Christ. So, the last point, God has never promised to save us from hell except for those contained in Christ through covenant of grace. So, to be or not to be. So, it is a compromise. So, it is left up to us. So, Benjamin Franklin, the last person when we are going to see regarding the pros. So, Benjamin Franklin was one of the founding father of the United States, a polymath. He was a leading writer, a printer, a political philosopher, politician, Freemason, postmaster, scientist, inventor, humorist, civic activist, statesman, and a diplomat. Franklin earned the title of the first American for his early and indefatigable campaigning for colonial unity, initially as an author and spokesman in London and for several colonies. So, his works, Franklin became a successful newspaper editor and printed it in Philadelphia, the leading city in the colonies, publishing the Pennsylvania Gazette at the age of 23. So, poor Richard Almanck. Sometimes Almanck was a very yearly published by the Benjamin Franklin, who adopted the pseudonym of Poor Richard or Richard Saunders for this purpose. The publication appeared continually from 1732 to 1758. It sold exceptionally well for a pamphlet published in the 13 colonies and print over 10,000 copies in a year. Now that we have completed with poetry and prose, now we are stepping into narratives. As I told you, it is not about the slave narrative as such, but here we are talking about Mary Roslin. Yes, a slave narrative indeed, but it also has a autobiographical touch. So Mary Rowland's son. Mary White Rowland's son was the first woman to write about her captivity during King Philip War in America. So she was born in 1637 in Somerset, England. When she was 13, she sailed with her family to Salem in Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were looking for a better life and running from the religious oppression in their mother country. So in 1653, Mary Rowland's son moved to Lancaster, where she met her husband. When she turned 20, she married Joseph Rowland's son, Lancaster Puritan minister. So at the beginning of her marriage, she lost her first baby girl. After that, she gave birth to three other children: Joseph, Mary, and Sarah. So Mary lived a great life with her humble family. She was spending all her time at home in the church, listening to her husband's sermons. In February 1676, Rowland's happiness was broken into when the savage Indians attacked Lancaster during King Philip's War. They took Mary, her three children, and 24 other settlers as captives. They killed the rest of her family except her husband, who was abroad, and then they set their houses in fire. So, after 1 week of captivity, Mary lost her daughter Sarah, who suffered from massive wound. Moreover, they separated her from her children for more than 11 weeks. Mary, who was once a white mistress, became the slave of King Philip's sister, Vitamu, who treated her aggressively. So she suffered a lot during her captivity since she was separated from her children, family, and culture. After 11 weeks of captivity, her husband John bought her freedom for 20 pounds and saved her from the horrors of captivity. After that, Joseph Rawlinson succeeded in getting his children back too. He then decided to take his family to settle in Witherfield, Connecticut. Yet, he died after 1 year. Thus, Mary Rowlandson took her children and moved to Boston, where she wrote her famous narrative, Sovereignty and Goodness of God, or what was well known as under the title of Captivity and Restoration of Mrs. Mary White Rowlandson. To conclude, all 17th century American writings were in the manner of British writings of the same period. John Smith wrote in the tradition of geographic literature. Bartford echoed the cadences of King James Bible, while Martha and Roger Williams wrote bejeweled prose typical of the day. Annie Bradstreet's poetical style derived from a long line of British poets, including Spenser and Sidney, while Taylor was in tradition of such metaphysical poets as George Herbert and John Donne. Both the content and form of the literature of the first century in America were thus markedly English. So, thank you all for your patience and support. Thank you for listening. Dr. Saket?
Thank you, Dr. Priyadharshini, for so meticulously presenting. And the presentation was as we had requested, as per the requirement and the subheadings we had provided. So thank you for that, and thank you for the efforts that you have taken, for the hard work that you have taken for preparing so many slides, and line by line you have explained. I'm sure it will be great help to the students, the participants who are preparing for various competitive examinations. I request the participants to please post your questions in the chat box. And yeah, so the way the PPTs were presented and the way it was designed was very student friendly. So thank you very much for understanding the necessity of the students, and for putting in so much of effort. That is what we feel. We heartily thank you for such a lucid presentation. And I request the participants, please post your questions. I'm sure they'll be posting few questions, and the participants really liked your presentation. You can see in the chat box. Yes. Yeah, here comes the first question. the first question here is, I'll just put it across to you, that what are the major differences between the Pilgrim Fathers and the Puritans?
So the Pilgrim Fathers, they were able to, they consider God for their faith and the religion, but the Puritans were consider God as a strict master. They knew that once when you commit a sin, when there is a sinner and you are deemed, but the fathers weren't so very strict as what our Puritans were. The Puritans purely thought that once when you go against the Bible or the teachings of the church, then you are a sinner. So if you would ask me, I would say they were more strict Puritans.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is, can you add something about Samuel Sewall and diary writing during the colonial period?
Yes, when I said about the pamphlet writing and when I said about the travelogues, I should have mentioned about the diary writing as well. Yes, they used to carry out their works in the diary and circulate. And Samuel Sewell, yes, I should research on that and I shall include more points on that for you.
Yeah, that we will include it in our book chapter, ma'am.
Yeah, sure.
Please, yeah, please, I'll put that point in that at that point. Thank you, Sidhu Tekur, for
Yes,
this question.
thank you, Sindhu.
Any other questions, participants? I hope you all have jotted down some of the very pertinent questions. There was the first female writer that Dr. Priyadharshi emphasized on. It is a very competent, item for a question. The next question is, what were the impacts of the Puritan writings in the society?
Yes, the impact was one, the main reason theology, so redemption, enlightenment, and of course, they tried their level best to bring people under the control of the church and the practices. They made them understand that we are supposed to follow certain norms, we are not supposed to move out of the norms, and things like women are supposed to listen to men, the children are not supposed to ask questions to their parents, so whatever is being said by the parents has to be abided. So all such kind of things, it reflected on the society, and over there the questioning factor was very less. Even it took time for them to question about the freedom, main reason being they had the fear that they're going against the church and they're going against the practices.
Dr. Priyadharshi, I was just curious to know, while you were researching about the Puritanism of American literature or American society, did you find any difference which it differed from the British Puritanism? Was there
British,
any point of difference?
the a very slight difference, because there when we are talking about Puritanism, when we are talking about England, or when we are talking about the a very major role is played by the crown as well.
Mhm.
So the liberty that they had here in America, they were not able to have it over there, because whatever it is, it has to parallel to the crown. They are supposed to have a discussion. So it is like a Calvinist, whether to be or not to be, it has to be discussed and come to a compromise. So a very slight difference, just that the discussion has to happen because of the crown.
Thank you. The next question is, Nathaniel Hawthorne, despite being a Protestant who believed in sin and predestination, deconstructs all the rigidity of Puritanism in Scarlet Letter. Why so?
Uh, Sin and redemption.
Nathaniel Hawthorne,
Hmm.
despite being a Protestant who believed in sin and predestination, deconstructs all the rigidity of Puritanism in Scarlet Letter.
Yes,
Why so?
yes, we have seen a few writers who have gone to the next extent, that who consider God not as a strict master, but as a as a person who they can really look upon. Like we had an author who took him as a partner. He was talking to him in more convenient manner before starting any of his work. So there were people who were trying to break out of it, remove few restrictions, and yet, stick to their idea of Puritanism. Scarlet Letter is it is social stigmatizing, right? It was more of society, social, and Puritanism had a very little part to be played. Yes, that person was a Puritan, but still, the work, the Scarlet Letter, it was more of social.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is, although this concept of cooked poetry and raw poetry yesterday also was discussed, today also was discussed. Can you just give 2, 3 basic differences which the participants will be able to remember?
Yes. So the cooked poetry, like as we were talking about Annie Bradstreet, the first women poet, though she wrote about her personal experiences, her letters to her husband, it all had a touch of English. So the Englishmen, how they used to write, how they used to bring up their personal identity. So like that, even Americans had the style. The when they're writing, they had a touch of English, cause of which they were called as cooked poetry. So when they weren't aware of the norms, or they weren't ready to create a new style, because they were of more with the blinkers that Puritanism, following certain rules and restrictions. So the line that the shadow of the English was felt in their work, cause of which they were called as cooked poetry, cooked work basically.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is pertaining to Annie Bradstreet. What did Annie Bradstreet mean when she called poetry and, under quote, a room of my own? And how might her life have been different if she didn't have this room?
Her life would have been totally different, because she moved from the place. She They relocated only hoping for a better life away from their mother country, only to have a better life, a better business. And that is there is where she found a husband in the new place. And if she hadn't to had this room for herself, I don't think so. She would have been the first woman to prove herself in the American literature. She would have been, sticking more to the Puritan thoughts and ideologies, and she would have avoided to what is happening only within the family. She wouldn't have ventured out. And same way, I would also tell about White Rosalind. We were talking about the slave narrative, the way she underwent the problems, the torments, all that brought them out of certain restrictions that they started writing. So they found that me time, a place where they have to think about themselves, write for themselves. So if that room wasn't there, I think they wouldn't have held a place in the American literature.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
The next question is, did the religious differences between the Calvinist, the Separatist, and the Puritans affect the literature produced in that time?
Yes, because I was talking about the person who wrote like God to be more a friend. He used to talk to God. He used to take the basic elements like justice, mercy, Satan, Christ, and all that. But when you talk about the Puritans, they do not indulge in all this, and they don't believe in the prayer, in praying to deity. So their thoughts, their ideas were totally different. And how it has affected the literature is, yes, it was purely about theological, it was sermon, it was about the things that is happening only around the church. But they also started writing about the self. They also started writing about something that is happening to them, the local, the community. So the three main points, as I said: God, community, and self. These three were the main points that was focused. So yes, indeed, there's a slight difference in the writings.
Thank you, ma'am. There are plethora of questions, which is testimony to the fact that they have really, the participants have paid very, serious attention to your presentation.
I'm happy.
And yeah, there are plethora of questions. I'll just put forward few more.
Yes, please.
Are there any references to the natives of American society found in the literature of this period, like in the explorers' narratives or such? And
Uh,
if there is,
mm.
what was their attitude about them?
Yes, when we are talking about Captain John Smith being the first American literature writer, I told you his writings he sent it through ship, cargo ship, which went to England. In that, he has mentioned about the natives. He has mentioned about people, how they are, what right, including their physical appearance to the food habits. So he has written about their Native Americans. They have written about their habitats and how different they are when compared to the Englishmen, and the difficulty that they're finding to maintain a relationship between these Native Americans. All that was put forward with, yes.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Next question is, it appears that authors wrote keeping in mind their English counterparts rather than natives who lived there alongside of them. This is an observation by the same person who questioned about the literature about the native.
Okay. So,
I Yeah.
yes, yes, please. Go ahead.
Uh, as far as I understand during your presentation, there was no production of drama fiction during this period.
Yes, yes,
Uh, Only there was some, I think, narratives
yes.
and a few poems.
Poetry, yes.
Yeah. So, what was the main reason? Was Puritanism only the main reason, or something else?
I would suggest that Puritanism would be the main reason, because when we take drama, we are supposed to be more imaginative, more creative, where not just Puritanism, but also the Calvinists, the separatists, they had their mind towards only religion, theology. So,
Mhm.
spreading of Christianity and things like that. Poetry and prose was just blooming even in our English literature then. So it was just carried forward by these colonies, probably by that 104 Englishmen who traveled over here. And it took a long time for them to get adapted to the literature as such. And so initially there weren't any drama or poetry during Puritan period.
So, I hope that answers the question to Sudipta's question, Sudipta.
Yeah.
Uh, Before we close, we just like your comments on some of the books you would recommend to the participants to have a proper understanding of the history of American literature.
Books.
Yes.
Yes. Is it okay if I type it out or I share the link?
Yeah, you can type, or you can say just, and they will be able to.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
The things that I focused mainly for my research, the links would be wonderful. Okay.
Mhm.
Uh,
No, we
uh,
cannot, we cannot have the links now. You can say the names. Everybody has an access to Google and can,
uh,
and
yes.
of course, in the book chapter, there will be this question. We will put it. Uh, Generally, the resource persons, they give a section called work cited. So in that work cited section, you will have a very clear understanding of the books that the resource person has referred. So just for the discussion, just to have a broader idea, we can have 2 or 3 basic books which the participants, if they go through, they will have a proper understanding of this period in particular of American literature.
So the book that I focused for my presentation, I would say I took up History of America, Book One, Book Two. So these two books I took time to go through pages, and I also focused on a few contemporary works. No, not contemporary exactly, I also focused on southern literature and the native American literature, how it works and now how it is. So things like that, when you're talking about Louis Drake or writers like Robert Penn Warren. Robert Penn Warren is the only person to be, awarded with poet laureate and Nobel Prize winner for both poetry and fiction. So when we are talking about him, his writings, he has written 12 novels, if I'm not wrong, and out of which 10 novels are purely focusing on history. So he has spoken about slavery, tobacco war, all that which happened in the history, and he very clearly depicted history in his writings. So having all these ideas of how people were able to, draw a line between their life and literature, how they reflected their life in literature. So I would say these are the few works that I focused on and I went through.
History of American Literature, Part 1 and 2 by who, ma'am?
Part 1 and 2 by Zinn. Howard
Howard? Yeah.
Zinn, Zinn. Book
Z-I
1,
double.
book 2.
So it's a history of American literature, book 1 and book 2 by Howard Zinn, Z-I-double-N. Yeah.
Yes.
So you all can just have a look, dear participants. And then you, of course, have different Routledge and Cambridge histories of American literature. Then there is a book by, I think, Andrew Sanders, History of American Literature. You all can go through it. And of course, in the book chapter that we will have, the work cited will be given. You can have a look at it. Book will be available if things go right, because there are a lot of things in the creation of a book, and I am completely dependent on my resource persons. So if things go right, we plan to release the book by September and October this year. So we will inform you. I think most of you all are in the Gnosis DAATH VOYAGE Telegram group. And I think most of you all are associated with me in various Facebook groups that I operate. So you will have that information. And of course, because of your registered emails, when the books will be released, you will be informed from time to time. So it was really, ma'am, a very lucid and a very exhaustive and very meticulous presentation. We are really happy and we are honored to have you on behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE. Thank you so much for such an informative session and lucid presentation. It was an absolute pleasure to have you, and looking forward to have you in the near future. Take very good care. Good night. Good night, participants. We again start tomorrow at 6. Thank you so much.
Thank you, participants.